Well, thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Tim, for hosting me. I appreciate that. And this is a challenging talk in the sense that we've got folks from quite diverse backgrounds. I know a lot of you. We have quite a few students. So I'm going to try to make this as entertaining and useful at the same time. And yeah, with that, we'll go ahead and we'll get started on a virtual field trip to the Persian Gulf. So the plan today is to talk about carbonate ramps and why they're important. I'm going to talk about their facies belts. They'll talk about how the Persian Gulf is different from the Bahamas, not just in the sense that it's not as big of a tourist destination, but in the sense of carbonate platforms and the sort of reservoirs we are drilling in the US right now. And then we'll bring it home. We'll talk about the Bakken, the Three Forks, and the Minalusa. While I'm going through the talk, you got to keep asking yourself, how does this relate to the reservoirs that you've worked on here in the US? Because that's what we're wanting to do. So a lot of this work began back in 2007 when I first started my dissertation work at Colorado State. And the plan was to go down to the Persian Gulf. And back then there was this new trend in a lot of these bigger oil and gas companies like Exxon and Chevron, where they were going and using satellite imagery to measure dimensions of grainstone bodies in modern carbonate settings. And I did so for the Persian Gulf. And of course, then I visited down there for some ground truthing. And since then, I've been there multiple times, mainly to Kuwait and to the United Arab Emirates. So here's the Persian Gulf. Here's your scale at the bottom left. And I've got a picture on top of Abu Dhabi, and then on the right is Kuwait. And getting there is fairly easy now. Some of these airports are major hubs, especially Dubai. It's one of the busiest airports in the world. And even before you're landing, you just get the sense of how busy oil and gas activity is down there. If you're traveling at night, you're flying over the Persian Gulf, and all you can see are these gigantic gas flares. It's like they've lit up the entire Persian Gulf at night. And during the day, this is on the right is a picture from Kuwait, and you can see all these storage tanks for oil and gas. When you do get down there, unfortunately, I had to start as a graduate student, and then being a grad student, you can only go down there in the summers when you have time off. So I went there in August, and little did I know that August is the worst time of the year to be there. In fact, it is so horrible that the Arabs have a term for August. They call it Agust al-Bur, which literally translates into miserable August. In fact, it's so bad that most of the Arabs leave. So when you go to Kuwait, it's actually empty. All the Kuwaitis are vacationing somewhere in Europe where it's nice and cool. And then in Kuwait, it's so dry, so dry. It's like holding a blow dryer to your face. It's very little humidity and it's ridiculously hot. I remember last time I was there teaching a course, I walked into the hotel lobby and the receptionist was like, "Oh, sir, good morning. Today's actually, it's a really nice day out. It's not too hot." And as soon as I opened the hotel room, the door, I'm like, "Oh my Lord," like the heat just hits you. And I looked at the thermometer in the car and it was 53 degrees Celsius outside. Now, Dubai is the complete opposite. If you go to Dubai or Abu Dhabi, where I was in the summers, man, I think the closest thing to that is being in a sauna because it's 100% humidity, again, over 120 degrees out. And I remember the first time I was out there, a good friend of mine who also went to OSU, he was driving me around and we're looking at these beaches. I'm like, man, this is insanely gorgeous. Look at those turquoise waters, white sand. And he's like, yeah, you just be careful. Don't burn your feet. I'm like, this is my college buddy. He's trying to be funny. So I go to Abu Dhabi and where I was supposed to trench this tidal channel that you're looking at in the picture. And I go out there and, I left my sandals by the car because I don't want to get sand in the rental car. So I start walking and I'm like, man, this sand is hot. And it gets hotter and hotter until I'm halfway between the tidal channel and the road. And my feet literally were burning. And I was like, oh my Lord, what do I do? Do I run back to the car? Do I run to the tidal channel? And in my mind, coming from Colorado, I'm like, okay, the water's going to be a lot cooler. So I should just gun it for the tidal channel. And I soak my feet in there and the water's warm. But the reason I'm bringing up the heat is just to set things up. When we're talking about the Persian Gulf, we're talking about an area with elevated salinities, and we're going to talk quite a bit about those today. So what's the big deal? What's the big hoo-ha about carbonate ramps? Well, as you know, that there's multiple types of carbonate platforms. Ramps happen to be one of them, but ramps have a disproportionately high number of oil and gas fields. So if you're starting from North Africa, starting from Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, getting into the Middle East, all the way into Pakistan, pretty much all those large oil and gas fields are associated with ancient ramp successions. So in the past, what folks have done is they've taken a carbonate ramp and they've split it up into three different parts. In the most distal portion below storm wave base is the distal ramp. Between the storm wave base and the fair weather wave base is the middle ramp. And then going landward of the fair weather wave base, we are in the proximal part of the ramp. And the way I've designed this virtual field trip, that's what we're going to do. We're going to start in the most proximal position, and we're going to go all the way out to where it says oolitic sands, because that's our major conventional reservoir type in some of these ancient ramp successions. Of course, we're not going to go distal of that just because, I'm going to show you pictures of what you can actually see. But there are reservoirs, especially a lot of these unconventional resource plays in the US are associated with the most distal portions of these carbonate ramps. Something else which is super important is the slope angle associated with these ramps. We're talking about a degree at best. Okay, so usually we're talking about half a degree or so. So think about that when you're doing seismic interpretation. You're not going to see the shelf margin or the shelf edge. You're not going to see any clinoforms unless you vertically exaggerate it. And I used to work for Chevron, which is where you always get, which is why I have these little yellow boxes at the bottom. Those were a requirement there, which is like a summary for the slide. But yeah, I remember being at Chevron and friends of mine that were working on the Kuwait business unit. They would have to vertically exaggerate their seismic lines, sometimes up to 30 times or so, just so they could start seeing some of those clinoforms. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're making geologic cross sections. They're not going to be a lot of these siliciclastics. When we do sequence stratigraphic correlations, we start seeing these clinoforms dipping, and those are fairly difficult to see along these ramp successions. Doesn't mean they're not there though. Okay, so the Persian Gulf is the type ramp. Every famous carbonate stratigrapher has been there at some point. Shoals did a lot of work there back in the day. Chris Kendall has done a lot of the work. In fact, he devoted his entire career studying the modern Persian Gulf. So on this map, unfortunately, I cannot see my mouse. I don't know where my mouse is on here, so I can't really point things out. My work computer crashed yesterday, so I'm having to use my laptop, which I don't normally do. So on the map on the left, if you look at the red outline, those are the margins of the Persian Gulf that I mapped out using Google Earth. And then they were supplemented by ground truthing, by actually taking trips down there, and then by looking at publications, work that others have done. On the top left, on that satellite image, what you're looking at is the Shatt al-Arab Delta, which is coming from Iraq. That's the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And unfortunately, due to recent anthropomorphic changes, mainly damming, there's hardly any water coming out of those rivers. So there's very little siliciclastic input into the Persian Gulf. So the modern Persian Gulf is purely a carbonate evaporite system. There's very, very little siliciclastic input. We get the occasional storms that'll blow dust into the Persian Gulf, but that's pretty much it. So I started in Kuwait, starting in Kuwait Bay, going along the margins of Saudi Arabia, around Qatar, into the United Arab Emirates, and I pretty much stopped where the Emiratis have really modified the coastline by building these islands that look like giant palm trees and world islands and things like that. The hashed line that you see extends from the Arabian side to the Iranian side. So we're going from the United Arab Emirates towards Iran, towards the Zagros Fold and Thrust Belt. And that's what you're seeing towards the right. That's a cross section by Chris Kendall. And what you see is that there's a lot of asymmetry associated with the ramp. So pretty much all the environments of deposition I'm showing you are associated with that low angle part, which is towards the left, and not the steep side that is towards Iran. Tidal ranges are between 1.5 meters and about 2 meters, so it is microtidal. But then if you look at how narrow the Gulf is, waves don't really get a lot of fetch. So it's not most coastlines are not wave dominated. And then tidal velocities in channels can reach up to 70 meters per second, which means they do create dunes. And we're going to talk about tidal channels quite a bit. The other thing I want you to note here, which is in stark contrast to rimmed attached carbonate platforms or isolated carbonate platforms, is the maximum depth. The maximum depth in the Persian Gulf is about 80 meters. So it's not very deep at all. So this slide, this is from a publication, and what I want you to focus on are the colors. I know the letters are too small for you to probably read, but I just want you to focus on the colors. And for a minute, I want you to imagine that you're a geosteerer. Okay, so a geosteerer, you're working the Bakken or the Three Forks up in the Williston Basin, and your job is to make sure that you keep the drill bit in the pay zone. Now, if you look at those colors, the first thing you notice is, well, man, that distribution is super patchy. Every time I do one of these modern clastics or modern carbonate talks, someone in the crowd always raises their hand and is like, well, Ollie, maybe you should clarify that, yes, facies change rapidly along depositional dip, but they're not changing much along depositional strike. So if you were drilling a horizontal well along depositional strike, we really wouldn't be running into a lot of facies belts. Well, I want you to look at this image, and you'll see that facies, yes, the magnitude of change, they're not changing as rapidly along depositional strike, but man, they are definitely changing. So it's not like you get these linear belts that just go on and on forever that we see in purely cystoclastic successions, especially a wave-dominated linear clastic succession, for example, the book cliffs in Utah. That's not what we're seeing here. Here, facies belts are changing very, very rapidly. So again, if you're a geosteerer, that's a pain in the neck. And what would make it worse is if your geologist gives you a cross section, which is based purely on lithostratigraphy, where he matches everything up to look as if it's layer cake, well, then you're in a mess. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind, especially for the later part of this talk, when we do talk about formations in the U.S., like the Bakken and the Three Forks and the Minalusa. So once you're down there, this is a picture taken in Kuwait, and we are standing right on the Sapka, which is this evaporitic flat, and you're looking landward. And when you're looking at landward, you're seeing these dune fields. Now, if this was a virtual field trip, to a modern clastic succession, I won't even show you pictures of dunes because yes, the dunes are there and they're cool if you want to go have a picnic, and you just want to sunbathe and stuff. But from a depositional standpoint, those dunes won't last forever because what happens is in pure cystoclastics, we have sea level rise, and with sea level rise, we've got wave rabinement, and those dunes will be eroded and reworked into transgressive sand bodies like barrier islands and flood tidal deltas and ep tidal deltas, things like that. But that is not the case in carbonates. In carbonates, all it takes is one rainfall for those dunes to get cemented. Now, I know it doesn't rain much. You're thinking, well, and this place doesn't look like it rains much, but it does. Even in a place like Kuwait, you do get about 52 millimeters of rainfall per year. And that's enough for the cementation process to actually start. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because dunes like this in ancient successions have been decent reservoirs. And on the top right corner, the thin section that you're looking at, that is actually from Aeolianites in the Bakken. We'll talk about those later on in the talk. But the one thing you can see in there is that there's alternating layers. It appears to have alternating layers of quartz and broken ooids. And then if you focus on individual laminae, those are actually inversely graded, which means smallest grains at the bottom, largest grains towards the top. So now at the same position, all we're going to do is we're going to turn around. So instead of looking landward, we're going to look seaward. And when you look seaward, this is what you see. So you're still looking at the Sapka, and you're now looking at the transition between the Sapka and the intertidal zone. Now, when you're walking around on this stuff, it's pretty cool because every step you take, it's like crispy. It's like you can feel the crunch underneath your feet, and that's because you've got a bunch of evaporites being precipitated here. It's a whole bunch of gypsum, and the gypsum is covering everything. Here you can see these current ripples produced by tides, and those current ripples are being covered by gypsum. And then it smells. It smells really funky, and it smells because there's cyanobacteria living underneath that gypsum. Okay, they're having a ball here because usually in an environment that has normal salinity of 35 plus minus 2%, there's a whole bunch of mollusks and other critters that will graze on those bacterial mats, and they don't do too well. But here, because of excess salinity, salinities at this particular location are around 47%. Man, that kills off most of the mollusks. And when the mollusks are gone, these cyanobacterial mats, they're having a party. So they're doing super well out here. But yeah, they do stink the place up. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because, again, whether you're looking at the Permian Basin and the most proximal part of the Permian Basin, these supertidal evaporites form a lateral seal to migrating hydrocarbons. And if you look at some of these giant fields in the Middle East, you always get alternating anhydrites with some sort of carbonate grainstone. And again, they're providing these seals that are much needed. On the left is a picture from the Paradox Formation. And you're looking at very similar facies in core. You've got an anhydritic microbialite, which is just a fancy way of saying that, you had gypsum-covered bacterial mats. And of course, you know how gypsum is not very stable. You could increase the temperature to about 90 degrees or so, and then gypsum goes to anhydrite, or you could bury it. Even at a burial of 600 meters, gypsum will go to anhydrite. So that's what we see a lot more in the rock record. But that's the Sapka. Now we're moving more towards the sea. We're going in a basinwards direction, and we are looking at the lagoon during low tide. And when you're looking at the lagoon, and I've collected the sample you can see in thin section, you're looking at a whole bunch of peloids. And there's still a lot of confusion, with folks who aren't working carbonates on a routine basis between what a peloid is and what a pellet is. So a pellet is just poop, all right? So there's a whole bunch of crabs running around, there's mollusks, they're eating and they're pooping, and all that poop has to go somewhere, and that's pellets. But in this case, what you're looking at are peloids. And how do you get peloids? Well, you could take shell fragments and you can micritize them, so they get covered by bacterial films. There's organisms that are boring into them, and slowly, through that micritization process, you go from whatever grain you started with into a peloid. And that's what those ovate brown grains are in that thin section you're looking at. All right. So a lot of sand grains get washed in here as well, and they start getting coated, and we'll talk about those here in a little bit. Now, that second picture was actually taken earlier, was taken later, and this picture you're seeing now was taken earlier. So what you should be seeing are a whole bunch of mud cracks. So this is what it looks like right when the tide goes out. Now, remember that slope angle with these ramps, we're talking about half a degree of slope. So when that tide goes out, man, we are exposing 2/3 of that lagoon. Okay, so a lot of folks, when they're thinking lagoons, they're thinking, oh, the lagoon is going to be subtidal, it's going to be covered with water almost all the time. But that is not the case in a lot of these ramp settings in the Persian Gulf. So the tide goes out, 2/3 of the lagoon is subarally exposed. And with as dry as it is, again, we're talking about 125, 128 degrees Fahrenheit. And the wind is blowing, everything dries up super quick. And when it does, we get mud cracks, mud flakes. And then when that tide comes back in, everything is reworked, and that is how we get intraclasts. And again, here's an analog. That's from the Permian Minalusa. And you can look at that thin section, and you can see mud cracks in there. Okay, and so that was formed in a very, very similar setting. The other grain type that we see are these cortoids. Okay, so what are cortoids? It's essentially you're looking at quartz grains that have a micritic envelope around them. Again, because as soon as they fall into the water, bacteria start growing on them, and next thing you know, they're forming these micritic coats on the grains. What you're looking at in the larger picture is a tidal bar, and then there's a whole bunch of salicornia, which is it's a sort of a succulent that grows out there. And the tracks you're seeing on there, those are made by a camel. So the camels, when the tide goes out, the camels show up, and then they're all feeding on the seagrasses, and they're feeding on the succulents. Now the seagrasses, that's one facies we're going to skip, and simply because I had a cool picture I'd taken underwater of the seagrasses, and then somehow I've lost that picture. So we're going to skip the seagrasses, but I will say this. Back when I went to school, and we had our first set strat class, all the focus were on larger buildups. So it was like, oh, well, kids, the way we get carbonates are from coral. And so always in my mind, I was like, oh my, all right. So you need these gigantic reefs to be making to be making carbonate. But in these modern shallow marine settings, these seagrasses, they're contributing to almost 68% of carbonate production. Okay, and that 68% is pretty evenly distributed between just 3 types of seagrasses. So they are major contributors of carbonate production. So skipping the seagrass meadows, the next facies belt, now this is the real deal. This is where we have these oolitic shoals. And what happens is, if you're looking at the picture, the inset on the bottom left, you can see these tidal between these T-shaped islands, which are fairly characteristic of the Abu Dhabi coastline. So what happens is, every day tide comes in, grains are moved around in a landward direction, then the tide goes out, grains are moved around again. You do that twice a day, and you start manufacturing ooids. So these tidal channels are where these ooids are being manufactured. And once they have been formed in those tidal channels, they are then, the dominant tide in this case is the ebb tide. And as a result, you form these large oolitic sand bodies called ebb-tidal deltas. And that's what you're looking at. They look like these little wings sticking out from these barrier islands. And that's where they form these fairly large sand bodies. For scale, you can see that there's a scale right by that inset. This shoal, this is about 5 kilometers long, and it's about 2 kilometers wide. So it's fairly large. How do you know that ooids are from an ancient ebb-tidal delta? Well, a lot of them have borings. So of course, the energy out there in the ebb-tidal deltas, it's not as high as the energy in the tidal channels, and it gives critters an opportunity to start boring, which they don't have in the tidal channels because the current velocities are too high. That's how we know that these ooids are from there. Now, I'm going to make a big deal about the ooids. And the reason I'm going to do that is because traditionally, we've used this term oolitic shoal. And when people think ooid shoal in their head, they're picturing a laterally continuous sand sheet of equal thickness. Okay, and this is fairly problematic, especially when you try to force that model onto the Persian Gulf, because there it doesn't work. So what I would hope you get out of this talk is a greater appreciation for the geometry and dimensions of oolitic sand bodies that exist in these ramp settings. I think one of the people who's joined us today is, we've got Ben Funderbunk, and Ben called me a few years ago, and we met up in Denver, and we were just talking about what we're doing. And then he was talking about how he's working on the Madison, and how these log signatures look super similar, but these wells are not in pressure communication. And the first thing I did was I just popped up my laptop, we fired up Google Earth, and we started measuring some of these ooid sand bodies, just to give you a sense. You're like, okay, if you're drilling into one of these, how much lateral continuity can you expect? Okay, super important, again, if you're trying to calculate reserves and you're trying to do volumes. Also important if you're trying to geosteer, or if you're trying to do any sort of increased oil recovery, you want to turn some of the wells into injection wells. So again, these oolitic sand bodies in the Persian Gulf, are very different. Okay, there's a very large diversity in their forms. So where do we get this Uwit shoal concept from? This concept of these gigantic laterally continuous sheets. We get them from the Bahamas. I've been to the Bahamas. It's a fantastic place to go. And so I mean, I certainly understand why people would want to go there on field trips. But if you're going to go there on a field trip, that's totally cool. But I think you should be realistic. You should be true to yourself in knowing what the limitations are. So the first thing is, if you're snorkeling on the Bahamas, you're snorkeling in about 5 meters of water in the platform interior. Now, when you start snorkeling off the edge of the platform, man, it's a freaky experience because you're snorkeling and you can see all the pretty fish and you can see all the coral and you can see every dune on the seafloor and every ripple. And within 5 minutes, you go from being in 5 meters of water to from 5 meters of water to about 900 meters of water. And you're like, whoa, everything just goes super dark. And it's pretty freaky, actually. But the reason that happens is because there's some super steep margins here. And once you go off that platform, I mean, we're talking about a very steep margin, huge contrast in depths between a few meters on the platform and then hundreds of meters off the platform. The other thing you get is a very distinct windward and leeward trend. If you're looking at this satellite image, you can tell that the windward direction is probably towards the northeast. Okay, so that's where the winds are coming from, and they're going towards the southwest. And as a result, that's where all the buildups are. That's the higher part of the platform. And waves are crashing into those buildups, and they're breaking material. And that's a lot of those grain-rich accumulations are all concentrated on one side of that platform. And on the other side, it's fairly mud-rich. Well, of course, we don't have something like that in Carbonate Ramps. And then again, Carbonate Ramps are super flat. You could be standing 10 meters away from the beach, and you'd be maybe in water that's knee level. And then you could be 2 kilometers from the beach, and you're maybe in waist deep water. So it's the bathymetry is very, very different, and the size of oolitic sand bodies is very different. Some of these Uwit sand bodies in the Bahamas, we're talking about, about 150 kilometers of lateral continuity, and they're 20 to 30 about 20 kilometers wide. So these are truly gigantic, and we don't get Uwit sand bodies that large in ramp settings. Okay, so just something to keep in mind. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, you're using an analog. Well, how applicable is it? How many isolated coralline buildups are we currently drilling in the US? I can't think of any. The closest thing I can think of are those Niagaran reefs in the Michigan basin. And there, yes, you do have coral, but it's mainly stromatoporoids, there's stromatolites, there's crinoids, and corals are part of the system. So again, we have to choose our analogs carefully. So the next thing I want to talk about real quick are Epiric Ramps. So when you're looking at a system like the Williston Basin, okay, you're dealing with an inland sea, an Epiric Basin. Well, if you are looking at one side off that Epiric Basin, you're essentially looking at an Epiric Ramp. So these ramps and the facies belts associated with these ramps are a lot more applicable to what you're doing, okay? The other thing I want you to notice in the picture on top is the symmetry that goes with this, okay? So the facies that you see on one side of the basin most likely will repeat on the other side of the basin. So what are we currently doing? Well, just before we started today, folks were talking to each other, talking about, hey, what software package are you using to make stratigraphic cross sections? And I think we ended up deciding that one of the best ones out there is actually Canvas. So you didn't hear Petrel and you didn't hear Petra, and that's because these folks are actually thinking about their cross sections. And I would argue that if you are using Petrel and if you are using Petra, there's very little thinking that goes into it, because in Petrel, you open up a new well section window, You toggle up a few wells, and that's it. It's done. Less than 10 seconds, and you've got a geological cross-section in front of you. And depending on how you pick those formation tops, most likely what you'll be looking at is a Lyric correlation like the kind that you see on my screen right now. Now let's compare that with reality. Okay, so let's look at the modern Persian Gulf, and we've got a 7-kilometer transect along the Saudi coastline. And in that 7-kilometer transect, we've got 6 different facies belts. Okay, so starting from A, we've got these Aeolian sand dunes. B, we get on the Sapka. D, we get on these cyanobacterial mats, and so on. Well, why am I making a big deal about this? Well, the reason I'm making a big deal is if you sampled A and you looked at the petrophysics at A, the petrophysics at A would be very different from the petrophysical signature you get at B. B is essentially evaporites. A is Aeolianites, very well sorted. C is pretty much all 100% pure algal mats. Okay, so they're all bound stones. So if the petrophysical signature is different and the lock motif is different, why would you expect things to match up in a log when you're correlating? They're not going to match. And if you are matching those up over kilometers, something is not right. Because if you correlate like that cross section shown above, what you're essentially saying is, well, if I'm on the basin margin, I'm on these Aeolianites, and if I go a kilometer towards the sea, I'm on those Aeolianites, and if I go 3 kilometers towards the basin, I'm still on those Aeolianites. Well, these are never-ending Aeolianites. That's not how it is. Okay, so these lateral facies changes have to be honored. Okay, and this becomes, it's a big deal when you're drilling vertical wells, but it's critical when you're drilling horizontal wells. Because again, at the end of the day, it's the geosteerer who has to keep the drill bit in the pay zone, and they need to know what trend they need to be drilling in. So I'm going to show you some examples from the Bakken. For those of you who are not familiar with the Bakken, it's kind of like a sandwich. You've got the lower Bakken shale and the upper Bakken shale. These are world-class source rocks, TOCs up to 14%. And then there's a middle Bakken member, and the operators are targeting the middle Bakken member. Now, if you look at details within the middle Bakken, of course, there's quite a bit of facies diversity in there. And part of the middle Bakken that a lot of operators target are these facies that I interpreted as barrier island Aeolianites. Okay, so all the different facies that you would expect on a barrier island. So we've got dunes, and then of course we get a storm, and maybe get a storm, and the storm goes across the barrier island. You get washover fans. So those are the sort of things we're looking at. Well, first of all, how do we know these are Aeolianites? Well, the first thing you see in thin sections, which you should be looking at if you're doing carbonates, is you're looking at a whole bunch of broken ooids. Now, here's the deal. The deal is it is super, super difficult to break an ooid underwater, okay, for a few different reasons. First of all, yeah, when we pick up ooids, they look like these shiny little balls. But if you actually looked at ooids underneath a microscope, a scanning electron microscope, they're not shiny little balls. They've got whiskers of aragonite needles coming off of them. Okay, so when you collide one ooid with another ooid, it's these needles that are coming in contact with each other. The second thing is the cushioning effect of water. You just cannot develop the sort of impact forces needed to be able to break ooids underwater. So how do you break an ooid? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to subaerially expose it, okay? So once the ooid desiccates and it's weathering, and then you take that ooid that's already going through hell, and then you bang one ooid against another by wind, well, that's when you start breaking up ooids. And that's what you're seeing here. You're looking at the thin section, and every little red arrow you're looking at is pointing towards a broken up ooid. Between those ooids are a whole bunch of quartz grains, and of course, then you've got dolomitic cement. This stuff is pretty plugged up, okay? Also, if you're looking at the lithofacies in there in core, you see beautiful examples of textbook Aeolian sedimentary structures. So we've got the world we've got one of the world experts on Aeolian sedimentary structures listening into this talk. So I got to be real careful with what I'm saying here. But pinstripe lamination is a term he came up with, so I think I'm good to go. So again, beautiful, beautiful facies diversity of these Aeolianites in the middle Bakken. Here you've got an example of some grain flow strata, which are these, so a dune has the Stoss side and the lee side. On the lee side, you've got avalanching, and that produces these sedimentary structures, and that's what you're looking at in the core on the left. They look like these little mini channels in core, okay? What else? Well, one of the things that a lot of folks don't think about in carbonates is the fact that the margins of these ramps, we're talking about the proximal edge of these ramps, there's a lot of channels. Okay, and what's the fill of the channels? Well, the fill of the channels, as I've told you before, it's mainly ooids. Also associated with those channels are levees. Now, this is very different from silicic-clastics. In silicic-clastic, we don't build levees associated with tidal channels. And here, the reason we're building levees is not because, of mud-rich, the flows that are coming down the tidal channel from land or mud-rich. That's not the case. What happens is you've got a big storm that comes in from the seaward side, and during that storm surge, sediment that's sitting at the base of these tidal channels, that is actually, it's pushed out and it deposits along the margins of these channels, and that's how you develop levees. Bottom line is there are lots and lots of tidal channel networks. In the picture that you're seeing, that's a picture I took flying over Abu Dhabi, and that gray zone that those channels are cutting through, those are algal mats. And on the right is a picture from the Bakken showing crinkly lamination interpreted as algal mats. So are there channels in the Bakken? And the answer is yes. Here's an example. This is a core that's at the USGS. It's a public core that folks can go take a look at. And what you're looking at the right is a scour surface. Right above the scour surface is a lag. And right above the lag are these trough cross sets. And it's pretty much all ooids. Okay, and on the left is some calculations I did coming up with how deep this channel probably was. And so around 68 centimeters. And I think this is from my dissertation. This is just a small one. It's a tidal creek, but these tidal creeks connect and they form these larger tidal channel networks. So that's something we should expect, are channelized reservoirs. The other thing we see are these washover fans. And how do you find a washover fan in the sedimentary record? Well, think about hurricanes. We're talking about super, super high winds. And as a result, we get upper flow regime sedimentary structures. We get a lot of soft sediment deformation. And sometimes we get things in carbonates that are fairly drastic, like these stromatolites that were ripped up. Now, if you've seen modern stromatolites, man, those things aren't exactly fragile. So it's not something that gets ripped up easily, but these ones were ripped up and turned on their sides. And that's what you're looking at in this core, again, from the Bakken. On the very left, you can see some water escape features, again, very typical of these washover fan deposits. On the right, you see some syn sedimentary faults. It gets complicated because you've got these Aeolianite facies, and then you have to distinguish between those from these washover events and the modifications to those dunes. Next thing we'll talk about, I am getting ready to wrap up here, is the Three Forks Formation. So this formation underlies the Bakken, and it's separated by the lower Bakken Shale. This is what charges the Three Forks. And the Three Forks, the primary reservoir are these dolomite mudstones with microporosity. So porosity, super low porosity. We're talking about permeabilities in the nanodarcy range. And what kind of facies do we see? Again, things that we find in the Persian Gulf. So on the very right, we've got, again, bacterial mats with anhydrite nodules. The picture in the middle shows a lag with pebbles on top, angular pebbles, and then right on top are cross sets of cross-stratified material. On the left, on the bottom left, are beach crusts. That's something we haven't talked about. I again, amongst the pictures that I lost some of my beach crust pictures, and these are pretty cool. What happens is, along coastlines in the Persian Gulf, as these waves hit the coastline, the degas. Okay, so you release CO2 that decreases the solubility of calcium carbonate in the water, and it causes calcium carbonate to precipitate right on the beach, right there and then. And these things cement so rapidly that if you're walking along the beach in Dubai or in Qatar, you can actually find coins and beer bottles that are stuck in the beach rock. Okay, so on the bottom left are some beach crusts, again from the Three Forks. And then on the very left top, you see some climbing ripples, and then there's a cone ichnus going through it, so a sea anemone that's probably living there. So again, what's the big deal? Like, why are we getting so focused on these details? Well, once you figured out what the facies are, you can start looking for cyclicity. Okay, if you're looking at shallow marine carbonates, it is a very, very high probability that there is going to be cyclicity in there. And then it is very important for us to be able to map those cycles, because that is what we're using to correlate. So we're not correlating using log signatures, we're correlating these cycles. And when you do that, the results that you get are very different than that layer cake model that I showed you earlier. Okay, so the first thing, of course, I blacked out all the well names and the information, because this was work that was done for a client that was drilling horizontal wells in the Three Forks, and they were having trouble geosteering. So unlike their pre-existing bench model, in here you actually see lateral facies change, which is a beautiful thing, because in these modern natural systems, that is what we see. Okay, so not only do we see lateral facies change, we do see some of that symmetry that we discussed earlier with these Epiric ramps. All right, now these cross sections would have been impossible to create without the benefit of core and looking at those cycles and those facies in detail. But when you have something like this and you give this to a geosteerer, you make their life a little bit easier. All right, the last formation I'm going to talk about real quick before we wrap things up here is the Minalusa, and we'll talk about the Minalusa in the Powder River Basin. And equivalent of the Minalusa is the Ingleside in Colorado, and I've done a lot of work on the Ingleside. So what lessons can we import to the Minalusa? Well, the first lesson we can import is, well, if you're going to be doing any sort of enhanced oil recovery in the Minalusa, we have to get a better handle on the sort of cycles that we can expect in ramp settings. Now, this whole concept of shoaling cycles originated in the Persian Gulf. If you talk to Mr. Bahamas, someone like Mitch Harris or Gregor Eberle, those guys together have drilled tons and tons of core from the modern Bahamas and other isolated carbonate platforms in the Caribbean. And what they'll tell you is there are no shoaling cycles there. And shoaling cycles is like carbonates 101. This is what we learn in school. So where does this concept come from? Well, it comes from the Persian Gulf. Well, why is it important? Well, that's because the boundaries of the cycles can either be conductive to fluid flow. So a lot of these super K layers that you hear about in the Persian Gulf, or sorry, not in the Persian Gulf, in subsurface fields in the Middle East, are subaerial unconformities, okay, associated with cycle boundaries, or they can be barriers or baffles to fluid flow, because these cycle boundaries can be associated with slight pulses of relative sea level rise. And what you end up getting at the cycle boundary is a carbonate hard ground. And those are baffles. So again, you need to know what kind of cyclicity we have. How will this affect fluid flow if you're trying to do enhanced oil recovery in ancient ramp successions? So in the past, folks that have been involved in trying to do this, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll lump it all together. So we're like, okay, we're going to make a big old cycle. Okay, we're starting from the base of the carbonates, going all the way to the top of the Aeolianites. Yeah, that is a big cycle. That's actually a sequence. Okay, you're talking about the sequence scale. So the SUs that you're looking at, those are subaerial unconformities. Okay, recently a lot of stuff has been published on the Ingleside and how a lot of these high resolution sequences that you see are related to glaciostatic changes. So if you're going to work on something like this, I would not recommend lumping everything together, because the problem with that is then I've seen folks trying to create pair sequences within the Aeolianite succession. And you know what? There can be cyclicity in purely terrestrial Aeolianite successions, but there are no pair sequences within purely terrestrial Aeolianite successions. And if you're going to try to look for flooding surfaces in there, man, it's going to throw you off, especially if you're using all old LAS files and gamma ray logs to do so. There are things that will have higher API spikes that people will sometimes assume are marine flooding surfaces, and they're not. So my advice is, if you're going to be tackling this, focus on cyclicity within the carbonate package. So within the carbonates, look for shoaling cycles, and then within the Aeolianites, you'll have to look for a different cycle type if you want to try to correlate something else that has, good, something that can be correlated over long distances, instead of assuming there would be flooding surfaces within those purely terrestrial successions. So finally, carbonate cycles are not pair sequences. Just keep that in mind. There's cyclicity at every scale in carbonates. And for those of you who don't know, the International Commission on Stratigraphic Nomenclature this year, one of the guys who's leading it published a paper, and they'll most likely be getting rid of the term pair sequences from any sort of sequence stratigraphic workflow. So if you haven't heard that, that's going to be a big deal. But anyways, what else can we do with the Minalusa? Well, instead of, traditionally folks have focused on the Aeolianites, what I would recommend is also looking at details in the carbonates. So here are some thin sections. And for those of you who are familiar with looking at carbonate thin sections, we dye these blue so we can see the porosity. And if you're looking at these, there's quite a bit of porosity associated with a lot of these carbonates. And right here, the one that says moldic porosity, that's in wood grainstone. So I think there's quite a bit of potential in the Minalusa, in the carbonates, and that's something to focus on in the future. All right, so what I'm hoping you learn today is that the Persian Gulf is a much better analog for most carbonate plays than the Bahamas. Okay, Bahamas are a fantastic place to go, but I'll tell you, the Persian Gulf is not bad at all, especially now. Food in Dubai is amazing. It's a lot faster than any restaurant in the Bahamas. And yeah, you're not going to have to wait 45 minutes while you're being eaten alive by mosquitoes. Facies diversity is super high in carbonate ramps, and these facies tend to be narrow. I cannot stress this enough. Facies belts are very, very narrow in these modern carbonate ramps. And facies are changing not just along depositional dip, but along depositional strike as well. These bacterial mass are great because you can orient yourself if you're looking at core or outcrop data, because they're always in the intertidal. You never get them in the supertidal. You never get them in the subtidal. They're always in the intertidal. So they're an excellent marker. As far as conventional reservoirs, tidal channels are fantastic because they're the ooid factory. And again, speaking of ooids, I cannot stress this enough. When you think about the world's largest oil field, reservoir, and you think about the world's largest gas field, North Dome, Qatar, what do they both have in common besides being deposited in a carbonate ramp? Well, the primary reservoir are ooid grainstones. So tidal channels behind the beach itself usually is skeletal material. And then we get oolitic shoals right on that rollover point associated with these claniforms. Now, unconventional plays, they're definitely there too. The Saudis actually started working on some of these unconventional resource plays in the most distal part of carbonate ramps about 10 years ago. They were looking at sediment gravity flow, so things like debrites and turbidites in the distalmost part of these ramps. And a lot of stuff that you're looking at in the Eagle Ford, the first time I'd never worked on the Eagle Ford, I'd always heard about it. And in my mind, I was like, oh, it's just going to be a chalk. And the very first time I looked at the Eagle Ford, I was shocked at how many turbidites I found in there. So again, a lot of potential for unconventional resource plays as well. And when it comes to our reservoirs in the US, again, what I would stress is correlating cyclicity. Okay, you have to deliberately look for cycles and then correlate those if you want to get a good handle on the geometry and dimensions of sand bodies. So with that, I appreciate your time and your attention. We are on LinkedIn, we are on YouTube. This talk today, I've recorded and I'll upload this on our YouTube channel if you want to share it with someone. We are on Facebook. I was told by my SEO guy that we need to be on Twitter as well, but I'm too old school for Twitter. So I don't think we're going to do that. But if you've got any questions, I'll take those at this point.